We're looking at the inflation in the country, and this is something that directly impacts millions of Indians. Inflation is above 6%. That was the RBI's red line. It had to be ideally beneath 6%. The question is, the centre doing enough to reduce prices? 6.26% is the retail inflation number. That's remained high. It's dipped just 0.04%, so essentially the same. Urban inflation has risen to 6.4%. That's up 0.5%. The index of industrial production is up 29.3% in May, but that is possibly because of a low base effect. We'll talk a little bit about that. I'm just going to quickly move across to my panelists. Madan Sabnavis joins us, as does Rajat Sethi and Amitabh Dubey. Amitabh, shall we just, before we talk about inflation, talk about industrial production? Because the way it's been put out is that the index is up 29.3% in May, but that it's up 29.3% perhaps, but is that because of a low base effect from last year when it had gone down, as I understand it, more than 33.4%? It's not what it was in 2019.
Yeah, in the kind of situation we're in, a month-to-month annual comparison is meaningless, because we had a very severe dip during both the waves, the first wave and the second wave, and of course during the lockdown. So I think we should look at moving averages, we should look at longer averages, and that we have to see how that pans out. I think there is evidence of what they call a V-shaped recovery, but this is to some extent an artifact of exactly what we're talking about. So I think it's meaningless to look at these short-term movements, and we have to see how these things play out over a longer period.
Rajat, effectively, as I understand it, IIP, the index of industrial production, is still 14% below the May 2019 level. So if you hype it to saying that it's 29.3% up from last time, it's not really telling the full story.
No, I think nobody is contesting the fact that there has been a low base effect, and this is why you've seen really high numbers. Some of them have gone up to the extent of 45 to 50%. So everyone, any serious commentator would know that there is a low base effect there. But what needs to be understood, and what is being celebrated perhaps in the government circles, is that there is a considerable momentum towards coming out of
recovery, yes.
Coming into a recovery phase, and that is what is cheering people up. It is going to cheer the markets up as well. So I don't see anybody is discounting that fact at all. That will be a misreading of why the government is so enthusiastically putting out these numbers.
Mr. Sabnavis, let's look at the other part of this, the prices of commodities. That's the bottom line. What does the average person actually spend? So let's bring up that graphic 3. Let's set up full screen on our screen. First, let's take a look at the price of petrol and the price of diesel, and the change that you can actually see. It's up 20.5% between January and July. Diesel up 21.6%, LPG up 20.2%, milk up 4.3%, and let's just keep changing. Chana dal down 1.3%, it's a bit cheaper now. Mustard oil up 9.09%. Is that it? Is that the last point? All right. And so, Mr. Sabnavis, here's the bottom line. If you've got the prices of so many commodities across segments going up to what they are now, are we not in deep trouble as we try and recover? People still out of jobs, salaries have gone down, inflation hitting the middle class person.
Actually, Vishnu, before I come to inflation, I would also like to give a comment on the IIP numbers. Yeah. I think the IIP numbers doesn't really cause for any kind of celebration, because we should remember that one is, of course, a statistical base effect which you spoke of, but we should remember that the corresponding PMI numbers which came for May was actually in a downward direction. And if I look at June, we actually gone into the negative territory. So I think we should not have this complacency to say that, look, there is a kind of a V-shaped recovery. So I have a slightly different view from what was said by the other panelists. And I think that we're actually going downhill, at least in the months of May and June, going by the PMI. Whether it's going to recover in July on account of the opening up of the economy, it needs to be seen. But my sense is we may not even cross the 50 mark as far as the PMI is concerned. Now, if you look at inflation, I think inflation has been a kind of a double whammy for us, because even last year we had inflation in the region of 6 to 7%. It's the second year which we're having of over 6%. Now, what it actually means, Vishnu, is that as a consumer, I've been affected first by 6% and cumulatively by another 6%. So I don't think it's happy time for consumers. And I would tend to believe that one of the chief responsible factors is the price of fuel. Not because it affects my driving costs, which of course is a direct thing. You can say maybe I'm a better off, I'm a rich person, I can pay for it. But I think the higher prices of diesel have fed into the price of transportation, and transportation goes into each and every commodity. So a large part of our commodity basket, where we're seeing inflation even of primary products, food products, they're actually being transported by road, which means that we have seen that your freight index had actually shown an increase of around 7 to 8% over the last 1 year.
Right.
And finally, if I'm a transporter, I'm going to put the cost on.
So that's a key point, and I take that Rajat had a point. Input costs have been going up as a result of oil prices going up. That's part of this huge problem. Rajat, go ahead.
I think that's the only explanation that we need to, really focus on. Because see, it's very easy to mix inflation and price rise. And it's one of the common mistakes that people do. Please understand, in inflation, and a classic definition of inflation entails, an overheating of an economy, an overall increase in the goods and services across the economy, and a constantly changing demand and supply of that. That inflation, that overheating, which should bother the RBI and try to, reduce the liquidity in the market, that trigger this 6% is not going to do. Primarily because this is essentially a single commodity price hike, which has led to across the board consumption basket, which has increased the cost of all the products that you've been talking about. So please understand, there is a difference between a price rise, which perhaps RBI will have very little to do with, which is governed by largely the international markets, vis-a-vis a classic case of inflation, where the RBI will perhaps have to look into the medium term and the longer term view and try to take corrective course corrections at this stage. But I don't see the economy getting overheated in its classic definition.
Amitabh, is this all linked to price and international and oil prices, which are very high?
Yeah, no, I don't actually agree with what Rajat said. If you look at core inflation, which is inflation without food and fuel prices, that is well above the historical trend line. In fact, that's also above 6%. So there is certainly a fuel component. And the RBI Monetary Policy Committee itself suggested to the government that they cut the excise duties on fuel as one of the steps to reduce inflation, which they have not done so far. And as we know, the excise duty has tripled in the last 6 or 7 years on petrol and diesel. The concern is that with core inflation higher and so many of the different commodities that you listed on your chart climbing, is that we could end up in a period of stagflation, in the sense that demand continues to remain weak if you look at a longer period of time. Consumer demand has been weak basically since demonetization, and of course it dropped very sharply during the crisis of the last year. So the risk that we face is that with balance sheets damaged of households and consumers in a very risk-averse mode, and companies also reluctant to invest, that we'll end up with a situation where the growth is not picking up very quickly, but the price inflation is very high, and this is a bad equilibrium to find yourself.
All right, I'm completely out of time on this program. I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us, but these inflation numbers give people in this country no assurance at this stage. Hopefully things will improve in the days ahead. We need to fight COVID for that. I'd like to thank you all very much for being with us.